Alone and you hear a knock, don't answer the door. That's the one rule my grandmother had always lived by. Growing up, I would hear stories about the old family house deep within the forest. When she bequeathed it to me, I thought she had just filled my young ears with tall tales to scare me. The house was like something out of a storybook, towering trees surrounding it, creating a thick canopy overhead. This meant that most of the day, the house was draped in an eerie shadow. There were no chirping birds or rustling leaves here, only the haunting call of distant owls and the mystery whispers of the forest. My first few days in the house were uneventful. I enjoyed the peace and solitude. The nights, however, had an unsettling silence. My grandmother's rule echoed in my mind. I brushed it off, blaming old age for her superstitious beliefs. One evening, as I sat in the grand living room engrossed in a novel, I was jolted from my concentration by a single knock at the front door. I froze. The echo of the knock seemed to linger longer than it should have. My eyes darted to my grandfather's old clock in the corner. Its hands pointed straight up. Midnight. Just my imagination, I whispered to myself. I tried to shake off the unease and dove back into my book, trying to lose myself in its pages. But then, it came again. Another single, solitary knock. It was as if the very air around me grew colder. Refusing to let fear get the better of me, I rationalized. It could be a lost traveler, or perhaps a neighbor needing assistance. But then I remembered. There were no neighbors for miles around. Suddenly, the silence was cut by a third knock. The force of it was so great that it made the old wooden door tremble. My heart raced, and cold sweat broke on my forehead. I stood up, moving as far away from the door as possible, finding a hiding spot behind an old curtain. Minutes felt like hours, but then I heard something even more terrifying. A voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakably close. "Is anyone home?" It crooned. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice sounded neither human nor animal. It was something different. Determined to protect myself, I tiptoed to the fireplace and grabbed an iron poker. Clutching it tightly, I approached the door, every creak on the floor amplifying my fear. I peered through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. Gathering my courage, I shouted, "Who's there?" There was no reply. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled through the trees, and in the distance, the low hoots of an owl echoed. It seemed as if nature itself was warning me of the danger outside. The knocking did not come again. I stayed vigilant the whole night, jumping at every sound. As dawn broke, I mustered the courage to open the door, half expecting some creature to pounce on me. But there was nothing. Only the footprints of something that seemed neither human nor animal, leading back into the depths of the forest. I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house and the surrounding woods. My search led me to an old neighbor who lived a few miles away. He spoke of an old legend about a creature that would knock on doors in the dead of night, trying to find its way into homes. No one knew what it wanted or where it came from, but those who had opened their doors never lived to tell the tale. I returned to the house with a heavy heart, realizing that my grandmother's tales weren't mere stories, they were warnings. I had fortified the home, never taking chances, especially at night. Years passed, and the knocking became a distant memory. But on some nights, when the moon is hidden and the owls call out in the distance, I remember that night. The chilling knocks, the eerie voice, and the rule that might have saved my life. Alone and you hear a knock, don't answer the door. The festive season of Halloween was always an event Jack and I looked forward to with great enthusiasm. We lived in a picturesque home in Rochester, New York. Our annual Halloween parties had become the talk of the town since the early 1940s. Strings of pumpkin lights draped our house, and the aroma of pumpkin pie wafted through the air. Every corner whispered tales of the supernatural, as guests exchanged ghost stories and children played pranks. That year, we had gone all out with the decorations. Cobwebs adorned to the corners, witches and ghouls hung from trees, and the distant howling sound effects added an eerie atmosphere. We had spent days preparing, and our living room was packed with guests in vibrant costumes, ranging from classic vampires to innovative space aliens. Jan, my best friend, always had the most creative costumes. Each year she outdid herself, becoming the center of attention and conversation. That night, as I was refilling the punch bowl, I noticed a shadowy figure outside, peeping through the window. Their costume was chillingly realistic and macabre, with dark, hollow eyes. Thinking it was Jan's latest masterpiece, I opened the door and gestured for her to join the fun. Moments later, Jan entered, wearing a completely different costume. A ball of dread formed in my stomach. If this was Jan, then who was the stranger I had just welcomed into my home? A frantic search ensued. No one recalled interacting with the mysterious guest, or even seeing them. Panic rose within me. Where is my daughter? She had to have been upstairs, playing with her toys, away from the adult festivities. I sprinted up the creaky wooden stairs, my heart pounding louder with each step. The sight that greeted me was a mother's worst nightmare. An empty room, silent and cold, with just a bloody shoe left behind. Despair and guilt consumed me as the joyous laughter from below now sounded like a cruel mockery. The police arrived promptly, their flashing lights painting our home in shades of red and blue. As the officers conducted their investigations, word spread of similar incidences occurring around the town. 4 other parties had also been graced by the presence of the unknown guest, and all had a child missing by the night's end. Weeks turned into a blur. Candlelit vigils were held, and search parties combed every nook and cranny of Rochester. Our once close-knit community was now cloaked in suspicion and fear. Parents no longer let their children play outside, and the once joyous festival of Halloween was now tainted with the memories of that tragic night. Jack and I were broken. Our home, once filled with love and laughter, was now a constant reminder of our loss and guilt. We eventually moved away, hoping to find solace in a new beginning, but the scars of that night remain, deep and ever present. Every Halloween, as the world celebrates with candy and costumes, I find myself reliving that horrifying night. The memory serves as a relentless reminder. Always be aware, always be cautious, for not all masks hide friendly faces. October 10th was a date etched into my mind with an inexplicable sense of dread. Each year, as the day approached, the calendar in our kitchen will have a date circled in red, then highlighted, and then crossed out for good measure. My mother made sure of it. From a very young age, I understood the significance of this day. On October 10th, I was confined to a particular room in our house, a small room with no windows, furnished with just a bed, some toys, and a lamp. Every year, without fail, Mother would usher me into the room, ensuring we had enough food, water, and distractions to last the day. The first few years, I was too young to question this strange ritual. I assumed it was a game, perhaps some unique family tradition. But as I grew older, the weight of the date became more apparent. Whenever I had school or any other commitments on October 10th, Mother would call in, making excuses to ensure I stayed home. Inside the room, the atmosphere was always tense. Every sound was magnified. We could hear the winds rustling outside, the creaking of the floorboards, and then, inevitably, the doorbell. A long, lingering ring that sent chills down my spine. I would often look at Mother, her face pale, her fingers tightly gripping mine. She never answered the door, and I never dared to ask why. As the hours dragged on, the doorbell would ring intermittently, each time sounding more desperate than the last. And then, just as mysteriously as it began, once the clock struck midnight and October 10th was ushered in, the ringing would cease. Silence would envelop our home once more. I had countless questions. Why this date? Who was at the door? But every time I tried to broach the subject with Mother, she would look away, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and sorrow. "Promise me," she whispered, "never to open the door on October 10th. Years went by, and the pattern continued. By my teenage years, I had grown somewhat accustomed to our annual ritual. Though the weight of my curiosity was ever present, friends would question my yearly sickness on October 10th, and I'd offer vague explanations. Then, one year, everything changed. Mother had a work trip she couldn't avoid. The date, October 10th. Panic filled her eyes as she realized the unavoidable clash. She sat me down, her hands trembling, and explained the importance of the room, the door, and the rule one more time. "Promise me," she pleaded. I nodded, my heart heavy with unease. That fateful day, I locked myself in the room, just as I had been taught, but this time without Mother's comforting presence. The isolation was suffocating. Every tick of the clock felt like an eternity. Then, mid-afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was long and slow, almost mournful. Hours seemed to pass, and dusk approached. The ringing grew more insistent. My heart raced. Every fiber of my being wanted to open that door, to see who, or what, stood outside. Then, a voice, soft and haunting, whispered from the other side of the front door, "Please, let me in." Terror gripped me. Who was this? What did they want? As the hours dragged on, the voice became more desperate, more pleading. Doubt filled my mind. What if it was someone in need? Someone who genuinely needed help? But I remembered my promise, and so I stayed put, my eyes fixed on the clock. When midnight finally came, bringing with it October 11th, the ringing in the voice abruptly stopped. The next day, Mother returned, and I rushed into her arms, recounting the previous day's events. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged me tightly. It was then that she finally revealed the truth. Years ago, before I was born, she had lost her younger sister on October 10th. A mysterious stranger had come to their door, and her curious sister had opened it. She vanished without a trace, leaving only a haunting tale of the sinister visitor who had returned every October 10th. We moved away soon after, seeking to escape the haunting memories of that room and that day. But no matter where I go, the chilling events of every October 10th remain forever etched in my mind. A haunting reminder of that day. I almost gave in to my curiosity.